In what turned out to be a portentous coincidence, William Basinski was finishing the final recordings of the Disintegration loops on the morning of September 11th, 2001. The loops themselves are ambient recordings on analog audio tapes, and inadvertently became recordings of physical decay. As Basinski was archiving the 20-year-old tapes, the metal particles on the tape on the tape substrate fell off and disintegrated into dust. Sound dropped out where the metal particles had fallen off, so what began as a lush ambient soundscape became increasingly and haltingly interspersed with gaps of silence that became longer every time the tape was looped. That evening, Basinski also recorded a video of the smoking tower of rubble as the sun set. So this is a cross-section of the magnetic tape. It consists of a polyester plastic base coated with a thin layer of iron particles that are magnetically manipulated by a tape head. So this is a diagram of how a tape head loops. There's the encoding head, the recording, and then the playback head. The erasing recording, and then the playback head. Only one is active at a time, but all three of them manipulate the metal on the tape to create data points. Data is encoded onto the tape by rearranging the iron particles, which can then be read or decoded by the playback head. Realigning the particles vertically on the tape substrate erases the tape. As tape ages, the binder begins to disintegrate, and the particles become less firmly attached to the substrate. When the tape is played back, instead of just reading the particle arrangement, the magnetic tape head actually begins to remove the particles from the binding. The finely arranged particles on the tape get pulled off and literally turned to dust. This is known as sticky sedation syndrome, and it is the process responsible for the sonic form of Basinski's disintegration loops. So I'm going to play a few minutes of the disintegration loops for you. It's a durational piece. There's about 8 hours of recordings. I'm only going to play a few minutes. I picked a piece that is about an hour in duration, and I'm going to play a minute from the beginning, middle, and end so you can kind of see the evolution of it. If you are interested in this, I highly recommend that you go back and listen to a whole sequence because the effect is very different. The change that happens in a given minute of the piece is actually very subtle and not easy to perceive, but over an hour, hopefully you notice that there's a dramatic difference between the beginning and the end. And I think that these loops are subjectively powerful for the listener, and this power derives from the Bergsonian notion of duration and intuitive experience. In The Creative Mind, an Introduction to Metaphysics, written in 1946, Bergson makes a descriptive analogy of the subjective experience of time as existing between two spools, and this is also can be literally interpreted as two tape reels. So this is a really good visual analogy for what's going on. This is the sort of reel-to-reel tape recorder that Basinski was using. It wasn't just a cassette tape that you would find in a record store anymore. So in Bergson's analogy, the first spool or reel is continually unwinding from the future as we proceed along the ribbon toward death. The second spool takes up the moments of experience and winds them onto the past reel. Each moment of existence in the present between the two spools is unique. Furthermore, each moment is affected by and contains our memory of all moments that are wound on the take-up reel, and is also affected by the anticipation of time unwinding from the quote-unquote future reel. It is only a small step to imagine Basinski's tape reels as Bergsonian spools. The music unfolds continually. Each iteration of the simple melody contains the memory of previous iterations of that melody, so that upon hearing it, the sound becomes a more comfortable and recognizable space. The key difference, however, is that Basinski's tapes are looped. In the Bergsonian analogy, the past reel is fed back around onto the future reel and things become ontologically complicated. Even though the moments of becoming and the duration are heterogeneous, the future also now contains the past. The future reel has been fed from the past reel in a continual loop. However, the physical limitations of the magnetic tape prevent the disintegration loops from violating this Bergsonian idea of duration. Even though the tapes are looped, they eventually fall apart in such a way that every repetition is a distinct instance of the melody. No two are the same. The subjective experience of this phenomenon is somewhat uncanny because it is so subtle and difficult to perceive in small intervals throughout the piece. The effect of the disintegration is really only totally obvious when listening to it in chunks of the beginning, middle, and end, as we just did. This phenomenon is perfectly explained by Bergson's phenomenology of time and duration. Each new iteration and experience of the melody contains the memory of the one that immediately preceded it. The change, due to the metal particle dropout, is so subtle that the memory fills in the missing part. At first, the gaps of silence are only perceivable as longer breaths between downbeats. But as they become longer, the gaps become a defining feature of the soundscape. By that point, it is clear that a dramatic change has occurred, but curiously, it has occurred almost without being directly perceived, despite the careful attention of the listener. Consequently, the disintegration loops are somewhat of a paradox. The repetition collapses past and future in a duration, but repetition is what causes the physical decay of the tapes and causes the output to change, thus creating imperfect and unique instances of the melody and preserving Bergson's notion of duration that is perceived intuitively. The fact that the final recordings of the disintegration loops were on 9/11 is a coincidence, but not one that can be easily ignored or dismissed. Although its repetitious nature might lead some listeners to superficially assess the work as boring, over the course of its duration, countless subtle variations accumulate to enact a profound change. 9/11, on the other hand, was a cataclysmic event. Change happened suddenly and violently, and the world became a fundamentally different place in ways that were not and could not have been understood up at the moment. The contrast between this and the change that happens in the loops is stunning, but they are equally profound, and the net effect is similar. When all is said and done, you are aware that something fundamental has changed, even if the obvious nature of the event is difficult to summarize or explain. For example, the extended gaps of silence or the missing Twin Towers. The same can be said of Basinski's videos of the towers burning. As the day turns into evening, the light fades, and by the end it is completely dark. However, when watching the video in real time, it is difficult to pinpoint the exact moment of darkness. It is also interesting that the video does not contain the event, just the aftermath. The disintegration loops also don't contain a distinct event, just the aftermath of the physical process. The loops can also be read as an allegory, although loosely, for what occurred on 9/11. Subtle and unperceivable social changes had been taking place for many years, whose cumulative result was a violent terrorist attack. Even though the events of 9/11 are extrinsic to the disintegration loops, because they occurred simultaneously, they will always be linked in collective memory and are frequently referred to as an elegy. This, I might point out, is a very Bergsonian effect of duration. The present event, or in this case the music, is forever and inextricably linked and related to the memory of prior events. The defining feature of all these elements is decay, physical decay of the tapes, the decay or destruction of the Twin Towers, and the decay of a social structure in New York and the world. The disintegration loops might also be read as an elegy of another kind, an elegy for the era of tape media as a ubiquitous format for cultural production of time-based media. In the early 2000s, digital recording of audio and video became ubiquitous and analog media quickly became obsolete. In the last 3 decades of the 20th century, nearly the entire cultural record was produced and saved on tape media. Because of the physical characteristics of magnetic tape, this record is in serious jeopardy. Degradation threats include mold, broken cartridges, demagnetization, and as Basinski discovered, sticky set syndrome. Several experts have identified a 20 to 30-year window in which all tape media must be preserved before it becomes impossible due to the degradation of the tape itself or a lack of playback equipment or expertise. In other words, in the world of AV preservation for tape media, the sky is falling. The sheer amount of media on tape combined with the increasingly rare and unrepairable equipment necessary to digitize it, and the shortage of trained technicians to do so does not bode well for the likelihood of preservation. Much of the media and information produced in the last 3 decades of the 20th century will be lost. There has been a recent uptick in digital transfer preservation efforts and funding, and it is likely that at least a sizable chunk of it will be preserved digitally, but probably not even 50%. The question then is whether or not this is a tragedy. While some losses are definitely tragic, in the end, I'm not sure that utter defeat and sadness is all that's left. In the preservation paradox in digital audio, media theorist John Stern takes a nuanced view of what exactly the goals of preservation are, or should be, and how the physical and cultural hurdles that, in his view, almost assuredly will create an information black hole for historians in about 100 years. His main points are that in order for preservation to be effective, there has to be a presupposed rarity of materials such that the items being preserved are in some way representative of the collection or culture from which they're drawn. If archivists, in their fervor, save everything, then the value of individual items is diminished. Furthermore, the archive itself becomes a morass of information for the researcher and more difficult to use. The other point he emphatically drives home is the ephemerality of digital media. Even though audio and digital files are infinitely reproducible without any loss, the likelihood of them being preserved with the relevant metadata is low, which makes them virtually useless. Consequently, while the loss of unique cultural artifacts is something that should be avoided if at all possible, the insurmountable project of digitizing all tape media should not be considered the greatest cultural tragedy of the 20th century. Perhaps in 100 or 500 years, researchers and historians will be grateful for the carefully curated collections they have at their disposal. Until then, we're giving it our best effort for the next 20 years, or rather archivists are, after which the history will be already written. In many ways, the disintegration loops are a crucible for this process of decay and loss. The act of playback contributes to their degradation, and looping the tapes accelerates the rate of decay. The loops give the audience a first-hand experience of witnessing decay that would otherwise take years to complete. Media archivists deal with this process on a larger and longer scale. In some ways, they are managing the information in the second Bergsonian reel of the past time spool. They make it possible for us to access the memories as the tape loops onward. but they also decide where the gaps are. By doing so, they are able to exact a subtle change that will have a profound long-term effect on how the latter years of the 20th century are interpreted in the future. Even though the timing of Basinski's disintegration moves was totally coincidental, they are a touchstone for a major shift in media history